A man stood in the middle of a quiet American street, surrounded by police officers who didn't know whether to step closer or run. His hands trembled, his voice cracked, and every word he spoke sounded like it could be his last. Locked around his neck was a heavy metal collar, thick and unfamiliar, ticking in a way that didn't belong in real life. He kept saying he didn't want to die, that he had been forced into something he didn't understand, that he was just a delivery driver who had taken the wrong call on the wrong day. The officers watched him carefully, trying to read the situation, trying to decide if he was telling the truth or playing a part in something they couldn't yet see. He said he had robbed a bank, but not because he wanted to and not because he planned it, but because someone had made him do it. Someone who had locked that device around his neck and handed him a set of instructions that felt more like a game than a crime. Except this game had a timer, and the timer was running out faster than anyone could react. He tried to explain that it was all part of a scavenger hunt, a series of steps he had to follow if he wanted to survive, clues that would lead him to a key, a way out, a chance to remove the device before it was too late. But nothing about what he said sounded simple, and nothing about the device around his neck looked like it would wait patiently for anyone to figure things out. The officers hesitated, unsure whether to treat him as a victim or a threat, unsure whether moving too quickly would make things worse. The man dropped to the ground, breathing heavily, repeating the same words again and again, as if saying them enough times might somehow stop what was coming. And then, in a moment that would later be replayed and questioned for years, the countdown reached its end. The device exploded in front of everyone watching, turning confusion into shock and leaving behind a scene that no one could fully explain. But here's the question that still lingers long after that moment faded from the headlines. Was he truly a victim, caught in a deadly situation he didn't choose, or was he part of a plan that went terribly wrong? Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. What happened that afternoon was not something investigators could easily file away as a robbery gone wrong. The moment the explosion echoed through that quiet street, the story shifted into something far more complex, something that refused to fit into a single explanation. The man who had been standing there pleading for his life was now gone, and in his place was a trail of questions that only seemed to multiply with every passing hour. Detectives began to piece together the fragments he left behind, the strange statements he made, the unusual device locked around his neck, and most importantly, the claim that he had been following instructions as part of a scavenger hunt. It sounded absurd at first, almost impossible to believe, but the evidence suggested otherwise. This was not random, and it was not simple. It was structured, deliberate, and designed in a way that forced investigators to look deeper than they ever expected. As they retraced his steps, one question rose above all the others. Who would force a man into a situation like this, and for what reason? The device alone required planning, knowledge, and intent, which meant this was not the work of someone acting on impulse. Then came the second question, one that made the case even more unsettling. Was this entire situation meant to end the way it did, or had something gone wrong along the way? If it was a plan, then it was a dangerous one, filled with risks that could not be controlled once set in motion. And if it was a mistake, then it was a mistake that cost a man his life in the most public way imaginable. The third question, however, was the one that kept investigators awake at night. Why did the clues he mentioned lead somewhere else entirely, somewhere that hinted at a deeper layer to the story, one that extended beyond a single robbery and into something far more calculated? What they began to uncover in the days that followed would challenge every assumption they had made in those first critical moments. The notes, the instructions, the path he was supposed to follow, none of it pointed to a straightforward crime. Instead, it revealed a design that was carefully constructed, almost like a game created by someone who understood how to manipulate both time and fear. And as each piece fell into place, it became clear that this case was not just unusual. It was one of the strangest and most disturbing investigations in modern American history, a story where every answer seemed to open the door to an even darker questions. Brian Wells wasn't a criminal mastermind, and nothing about his life suggested he was capable of planning something so elaborate or dangerous. He was the kind of man people saw every day without thinking twice, a quiet, routine-loving pizza delivery driver who moved through life without drawing attention to himself. He worked his shifts, made his deliveries, and returned home to a life that rarely changed. To customers, he was just the familiar face at the door, someone who showed up on time, handed over the order, and left without much conversation. He wasn't known for causing trouble, and he didn't carry the kind of reputation that would make anyone suspect he could be involved in something like a bank robbery, let alone a case that would later shock the entire country. His world was small, predictable, and for the most part, uneventful, which is exactly why what happened next felt so difficult to understand. People who knew him described him as introverted, someone who kept to himself and didn't go out of his way to be social. He wasn't the center of attention in any room, and he seemed comfortable living on the edges of other people's lives rather than in the middle of them. He had his routines, his habits, and the kind of quiet existence that rarely raised questions. But as investigators began to look closer, small details started to surface, details that didn't quite fit the image everyone had of him. There were whispers about the people he associated with, connections that seemed unusual for someone like him, and choices that hinted at a side of his life few had paid attention to before. These weren't loud or obvious red flags, but they were enough to make investigators pause and reconsider who Brian Wells really was beneath the surface. Those whispers didn't provide answers, but they introduced uncertainty, and in a case already filled with confusion, uncertainty only made things more complicated. It raised the possibility that Brian's life wasn't as simple as it appeared. That there were layers to his story that had gone unnoticed until it was too late. And as those layers began to unfold, one thing became clear. The events of that day didn't come out of nowhere. They were connected to something, whether it was a decision he made, a person he trusted, or a situation he found himself unable to escape. And on what started as just another ordinary afternoon, a routine delivery turned into the moment that changed everything, setting off a chain of events that would leave behind more questions than answers. August 28, 2003 began like any other day in Brian Wells' routine, with deliveries to make and nothing to suggest that within hours, his name would be tied to one of the most disturbing crimes in American history. At some point that afternoon, Brian walked into a local bank, moving with a kind of urgency that didn't match the quiet, reserved man people thought they knew. In his hand he carried a cane, something that didn't immediately alarm anyone, and along with it, a note. At first glance, it looked like a typical robbery demand, the kind tellers are trained to respond to without hesitation. But as the note was read more carefully, it became clear that this was something entirely different. It wasn't just asking for money, it was giving instructions, specific and deliberate, as if Brian himself were following a script written by someone else. The situation escalated quickly, but not in the way most robberies do. There was no sudden panic, no chaotic rush for the exit, just a tense, controlled sequence of events that felt almost rehearsed. Brian waited, collected the cash, and left the bank, but what no one inside fully understood in that moment was what was hidden in plain sight. Strapped tightly around his neck, partially concealed but undeniably real, was a locked explosive device. It wasn't something improvised or accidental, it was constructed with intent, designed to stay in place, designed to do exactly what it was meant to do. And if Brian's words were to be believed, he didn't have the ability to remove it, even if he wanted to. Once outside, the situation shifted from confusion to urgency. Police were alerted and quickly moved in, surrounding Brian before he could get far. He didn't run, he didn't resist, instead he complied in a way that only made the situation more unsettling. He sat down on the ground, the weight of the device around his neck now impossible to ignore, both for him and for the officers trying to figure out how to respond. His voice, strained and uneven, carried a message that no one wanted to hear but everyone needed to understand. He told them it was going to go off, that he didn't have much time, that whatever plan he had been forced into was already reaching its end. In those moments, every decision mattered, but there was no clear path forward. The officers hesitated, trying to assess whether they could safely approach, whether there was time to intervene, or whether any sudden movement would make things worse. Brian remained where he was, repeating the same warning, his fear no longer something he could hide. And then, without resolution, without the chance for anyone to change the outcome, the countdown reached its final seconds. Right there, in front of everyone, the device detonated, ending Brian Wells' life and turning a strange robbery into a case that would haunt investigators for years to come. In the immediate aftermath, the scene left behind raised more questions than answers, and for a brief moment the explanation seemed almost straightforward. Brian Wells was seen as a victim, a man forced into a deadly situation he didn't choose, someone who had been manipulated into carrying out a robbery under the threat of losing his life. That theory made sense in those early hours, especially given what officers had witnessed with their own eyes, his fear, his compliance, and the way he repeatedly insisted that he had no control over what was happening. It painted a picture of a man trapped in a plan designed by someone else, someone willing to risk everything to achieve a goal that still wasn't clear. But as investigators began to slow things down and examine each detail more closely, that initial assumption started to weaken. The deeper they looked, the more the story began to shift into something far more complicated. The first signs that something wasn't right came from the instructions Brian had mentioned. Investigators recovered pieces of the scavenger hunt he claimed to be following, a series of notes that directed him to different locations with the promise that each step would bring him closer to removing the device. But when those locations were traced and examined, they didn't lead to anything useful. Some directions ended abruptly, others pointed to places that had no connection to the case, and the overall structure of the plan felt incomplete, almost as if it had been designed to fail from the start. This raised a critical question. If the instructions were meant to save him, why did they lead nowhere? And if they weren't meant to save him, then what was their real purpose? As investigators continued to connect the dots, certain names and relationships began to surface, pulling the case in a direction no one had expected. Among them was a woman whose past raised immediate concern, someone known for manipulation, someone who had been involved in unusual situations before. Her connection to the case wasn't obvious at first, but as more evidence came forward, it became harder to ignore. She wasn't alone either, as the investigation began to uncover the possibility of a broader conspiracy involving multiple people, each playing a role in a plan that was far more coordinated than it initially appeared. At this point, federal authorities, including the Federal Bureau of Investigation, became involved, bringing additional resources and attention to a case that was quickly gaining national focus. With every new discovery, the image of Brian Wells as a completely innocent victim became harder to hold onto without question. There were inconsistencies in his story, details that didn't quite match the evidence, and connections that suggested he may have been aware of more than he admitted in those final moments. Investigators didn't jump to conclusions, but they couldn't ignore what was beginning to take shape. Then came a realization that shifted the direction of the entire case. As they pieced together timelines, relationships, and motives, they uncovered something chilling, something that forced them to reconsider everything they thought they knew. Brian Wells might not have been telling the full truth, and if that was the case, then his role in this story was far more complicated than anyone had first believed. The case took a shocking turn when investigators finally began to see the full picture come together, piece by piece, connection by connection. What once appeared to be a random victim caught in a terrifying situation was now being viewed through a completely different lens. The evidence suggested that Brian Wells may not have been as unaware as he claimed in those final moments. Instead, there were indications that he could have been part of the plan from the beginning, not necessarily as the architect, but as someone who agreed to play a role in exchange for something he believed he would gain. That possibility changed everything because it meant the line between victim and participant was no longer clear, and the story was no longer about a man forced into a crime, but about a plan that may have involved him from the start. As the investigation deepened, a conspiracy began to take shape, one that involved multiple individuals, each contributing to a design that was far more calculated than anyone initially imagined. At the center of it was the idea of manipulation, a plan guided by someone who understood how to influence others, how to create a situation where people would follow instructions without fully questioning the outcome. The device, the notes, the sequence of events, none of it was random. It pointed to control, to someone orchestrating the situation in a way that ensured every step led closer to a specific result. And at the heart of that result was a motive tied to money, a motive that drove the entire operation forward, even if it meant risking lives in the process. For those trying to make sense of it, the emotional weight of the case only grew heavier. If Brian Wells had some level of involvement, then his final moments took on a different meaning, one where fear and realization may have collided in ways no one could fully understand. But even with arrests, statements, and a clearer outline of the conspiracy, there was still something missing, a gap in the story that refused to be filled. Because even after everything that had been uncovered, one question remained unanswered, and it was a question that continued to linger long after the case had moved through the courts and into history. Even after arrests were made, after trials were held, and after convictions brought a sense of closure to the public, the full truth behind what happened to Brian Wells was never completely clear. Investigators were able to outline the conspiracy, to identify the individuals involved, and to present a version of events that explained how such a plan could come together. But explanations are not the same as certainty, and in this case, certainty always seemed just out of reach. There were gaps that could not be filled, moments that could not be fully reconstructed, and intentions that could only be interpreted through evidence that didn't always tell the whole story. For some, the case was solved, a tragic example of greed and manipulation leading to a devastating outcome. For others, it remained unresolved, a puzzle with pieces that didn't quite fit no matter how they were arranged. And at the center of it all was Brian Wells, the man whose final moments were witnessed by police and later questioned by millions. The question that lingered was not just about what happened, but about who he truly was in the context of that plan. Was he a victim trapped in a deadly situation, someone who believed he could follow instructions and survive, only to realize too late that there was no way out? Or was he a man who made a choice, who stepped into something dangerous with the expectation that he could control the outcome, only to find himself unable to escape once it began? The answer depends on how you interpret the evidence, and even then, it may never feel complete. Because in this case, the line between victim and accomplice was never clearly defined, and perhaps it never will be. What do you think really happened to Brian Wells in those final moments? Was he truly forced into a situation he never wanted to be part of, or was he involved in a plan that slipped beyond his control when it mattered most? Because the more you look at the details, the harder it becomes to land on a single answer, and that uncertainty is exactly what has kept this case alive in conversations for years. And if you think this story is disturbing, wait until you hear about the case where the victim came back years later, a story that challenges everything you think you understand about truth and survival. Subscribe for more real-life crime stories that don't make sense until they do, and make sure you stay with us for the next one.